So I wanted to welcome all of you on this eve of Earth Day for this really interesting and important presentation on really the regional differences in US climate change. This event is being co-sponsored by the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance and by Yale Blue Green. I am Joellen Gray. I'm chair of the New England chapter of the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, or YANA as we call it. And Eleanor Pepples is the chair of the Bay Area San Francisco region. We wanted to do this together because as we talked about regional differences, we realized that it was so important that others really highlighted for us the differences. We are just laymen ourselves, so we're looking forward to hearing what those differences are. And really wanted to understand as well how we could take action. We thought this was a great forum to bring together some remarkable speakers. And I'm going to ask Eleanor to introduce our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Joellen. It's a pleasure to be here with such august company today. I'd like to introduce Anthony Leisterowitz, founder and director of the Yale program on climate change and a senior research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment. He's an expert on public opinion and public engagement with the issues of climate change and the environment. He's also host of the daily radio broadcast Climate Connections. We also have with us today Maura McKnight. She's the executive director of the Business Council on Climate Change, a San Francisco-based multi-sector partnership dedicated to incubating, scaling, and sharing world-leading solutions to address climate change. An action-oriented leader, she spent 18 years working at the intersection of climate, energy, technology, conservation, business development, and social impact. Also with us tonight is David Pogue. He's Yale 85, a 6-time Emmy winner for his stories on CBS Sunday Morning, host of 20 Nova Science specials on PBS, and creator-host of the podcast Unsung Science. He's also written or co-written more than 120 books, including How to Prepare for Climate Change, a practical guide to surviving the chaos. And we'll hear remarks from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He's Yale 78. He's earned a reputation in the Senate as a fierce advocate for progressive values and a thoughtful legislator capable of reaching across the aisle to achieve bipartisan solutions. Representing the ocean state, Whitehouse plays a key role in crafting policies, addressing climate change, environmental protection, and America's clean energy economy. But first, we'd like to hear from Lauren Graham. Well, I should just say we'd like to thank you, and also Chip Spear of Yale Blue Green. Lauren, would you like to tell us about Yale Blue Green and some of its initiatives?
Thank you, Eleanor. I'm sorry I'm not seated and on camera to see all of you. I'm in transit, unfortunately. But thank you so much for all the hard work that you put in to make this event this evening a possibility. Yale Blue Green is a shared interest group for all alums who are interested in environment and sustainability. So it doesn't matter what your program is or whether or not you studied or are professionally in the space, we are a home for you. We have chapters spread across the country, including one in London in the UK. And right now we have Chip on the line as well. Chip is one of the co-chairs of our board. And we've been developing our programming, particularly our webinar series. We have a book club. It's so nice to see David on the line. We hosted his book last year. And I'm available to speak with anyone who is interested in joining our group. The board will be hosting elections for new members soon, and it's the home for everyone. We also have a sustainability initiative that's really focused on helping to push the university's priorities and agendas in the space. So if advocacy is something that you're interested in as well, we have that as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lauren. We really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're between events, so and one of them is in person. We were just talking about that a while ago. So thank you very, very much. And thank you also for connecting us with Chip, who has been fabulous all day long today. Before we begin, I just wanted to give you a quick word about format. Each of the presenters will talk for about 5 to 8 minutes. Then we'll open it up to Q&A. And then about 7:30, we'll actually move into 3 different regional breakout rooms. Just before that, Chip's going to tell us how he helped define those breakouts, which is fantastic. Anyway, I'd like to begin by asking Tony, can you tell us how Americans really view climate change? Are they willing to act?
So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's great to be with the Yale family spread around the world. So let me share my screen, and if I can get a thumbs up that you can actually see it. All right, great. And you're getting the full screen?
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so great to be with you all. My name is Tony Lazowitz. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of the Environment. We used to be known as the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Now it's the School of the Environment. And I direct the Yale program on climate change communication. We basically study how Americans and others around the world respond to this issue. What do they understand and misunderstand? How do they perceive the risks? What kinds of policies they support or oppose? What kinds of behaviors are they willing to change? And then what are the psychological, cultural, and political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue? Others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile. Now, I don't have time to go into much detail about anything, so I'm just going to pull out a few tidbits from about 15 years worth of work that we've been doing here at Yale. And so basically, we do nationally representative surveys, one every spring, every fall, every spring, every fall, and have been doing that for over 15 years. So it gives us this incredible ability to see change in the American mind as they think, as they feel, you know, what's in their heads, what's in their hearts, what's in their hands, as in what they're doing about this issue. So let's just jump in and take a look at some of the big picture things that we're seeing. So what you're looking at here is a series of results on the question, do Americans think that global warming is happening? Like, is it real? And the series starts off on the far left of your screen in the fall of 2008. Senator Whitehouse is going to mention this same time period later, so this is just a quick teaser. But at that time, American opinion was at an all-time high in terms of accepting that climate change was happening. It then dropped 14 percentage points from 2008, bottoming out in 2010. And since then, it's been slowly working its way back up until March of last year, it was at 70%. And then suddenly in September of last year, so just 6 months apart, it jumped 6 percentage points. That's the largest single increase that we've seen in this entire record to an all-time high, 76%. So first of all, you know, congratulations, America. We're at an all-time high. But just to put that into global context, if we were in Japan or Brazil, this number would be over 95%. So we still have a ways to go in this country, even accepting that climate change is actually happening. But then when we turn to, do Americans understand that global warming is mostly human caused? It's not quite as good. So here again is that last study that we did in September. By this time, it was at 60%, near the all-time high, not at the all-time high. But you still have about 27% of Americans who think that climate change is natural. And that's a fundamental and important misunderstanding, because if it's natural, it's just natural cycles, then maybe many people don't understand why we need to do things like reduce carbon pollution, why we would need to put a price on carbon or regulate carbon dioxide or the other greenhouse gases that are so important here. So this too is still remaining an important communication and even education need among the American public. And then this is a point that's really also important, is that many Americans don't understand that there's an overwhelming scientific consensus that human-caused global warming is happening, okay? That's simple, okay? Is it real? Is it human-caused? Okay, not like what's going to happen to the monsoon in India in the year 2080, about which there's a lot of scientific uncertainty, but the fundamentals. Is it real, and is it human-caused? And multiple studies using totally different techniques have all zeroed in on the finding that it's about 97 to 99% of climate scientists are convinced of these fundamental facts. And yet only 1 in 5 Americans understands that it's more than 9 out of 10 scientists. And that's a consequential misunderstanding because people realize they're not experts about this issue. They look to experts on this and many other issues to guide us through this ever more complicated landscape of risk. And when your perception as a layperson is the scientists haven't even made up their mind yet whether this is real or human caused, then many people just adopt a wait and see attitude. They're basically saying, hey, scientists, go off somewhere and figure this out. And when you do, and if it's important, you'll come tell us, right? Not realizing, of course, that the scientific community literally did that 40 years ago. And just the important point to note here, there's a number of different factors behind this, but one of the big ones is the fact that this is the explicit goal and strategy of a massive communications effort by the fossil fuel industry and its allies to confuse the public. This is the same strategy that was used by the tobacco industry to basically, it's in their files, it says doubt is our product. They knew they didn't have to convince Americans that smoking was bad for you. They just needed to convince Americans that the science wasn't certain yet. And in those conditions, people would keep smoking. And literally for extra decades, the tobacco industry raked billions of dollars extra into their coffers because of that very effective strategy. That exact same strategy, in fact, some of the exact same experts that were disputing the human health impacts of cigarette smoke were actually then brought into the climate issue and said climate change isn't real, or it's not human caused, or it's not a serious problem, or some even argued that it would be good for us. So it's just to say this is still a fundamental misunderstanding that many people continue to have about climate change, and it's slowing progress. And one of the other really critical variables that we look at is just worry. So again, this is the emotional side of the issue. It's very predictive of how people feel and what they support and are willing to do. And we're at an all-time high, 70% last September, 35% all-time high that are very worried, but it's only 35%. And one of the main reasons why that is, and we've seen this consistently here in the US and around the world, is that many people still think of climate change as a distant problem, distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears or developing countries, not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it becomes psychologically distant. It's just one of 100 other issues that's out there. I don't see why this is that important. I don't see why this is urgent that we take action immediately. And that's really the situation we're now in. So this too is a fundamental thing. And this is where it really does get local and regional. How do you help people connect the dots between this seemingly distant, abstract, global problem and the way that climate change is already affecting our lives right here, right now? We'll come back to that theme, I'm sure. And what we're beginning to see is some really interesting things happening in just that past year. So here, Americans we found increased by 12 percentage points, by far the single largest jump in this record, that global warming is starting to affect weather in the United States. That's a really big jump. Now it's only 43%, so we have a long way to go because in fact, global warming is affecting weather in the United States. It has been affecting weather in the United States for a long time. But those impacts are starting to really hit home and people are finally starting to connect the dots. Likewise, we've just saw a 10-point increase from March of last year to September of last year, just over that 50% threshold of Americans saying that they've personally experienced the effects of global warming. So again, it's only 50%, but it's definitely an upward trend. Yeah, okay, so then here's the other thing I really want to just introduce you to, and this is an interactive tool that I'd highly encourage you to come to our website and take a look. Just Google the words Yale Climate Opinion Maps, and you'll find it very easily. And basically, this is a tool that we have helped pioneer that basically allows us to take all that national data and develop very accurate estimates of the state of public engagement with this issue for all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, the 1,000 largest cities, and 3,000 plus counties across America, okay? And so in the past, everything I just showed you was at the national level, and that's great at the national level, it's very useful, but in the end, we live in specific states, we live in specific localities, and most of the decisions about climate change are going to happen at state and local levels, especially once we start talking about vulnerability, preparedness, and adaptation. So this tool is now allowing us to see below the hood, to see all kinds of details that we just couldn't see before with these purely national numbers. So let me show you what I mean. So here's that same map, but now at the county level of Americans who are worried about global warming. The darker the red the county, the more worried people are. Now, the higher proportion of people are worried about global warming. The darker blue, the lesser the proportion of people in those places. And you can immediately see there's a lot of variation across the country in terms of people's worry. One of the big ones I want to just quickly point to is the state of Texas. Many people think of Texas stereotypically as a very conservative, deep red state, long led by climate denying governors. Seems like the last place you could go for a constructive conversation about climate change. Turns out it's not true. What we find is that these counties right along the border are more worried about climate change than most of the counties in liberal California. So why is that? Well, this aligns with a lot of our other research, which finds another piece of common wisdom about climate change is wrong, which is that many people think climate change is an issue that only white, well-educated, upper middle class, latte sipping liberals care about. That's not true. In fact, it's people of color who care the most about climate change, in particular Latinos. That's what you're seeing here in Texas, but you're also seeing here among Native Americans. You also see it among African Americans through this region, which is called the Black Belt through the Deep South, and so on. So just hold that thought. So back to this question that many people don't yet really understand how climate change will affect them. So we ask, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? And we find that a majority of Americans in every single county in America, Oklahoma, Texas, Nevada, it doesn't matter. Everywhere, a majority thinks global warming will harm plants and animals. Okay, but will it harm Americans? Not quite so much. Okay, will global warming harm you personally? Oops. Much less. Much less. Okay. Now here again, you're seeing in yellow those places where it is actually over a majority. And note that that's exactly those areas I was just talking about. Here's South Florida, here's Texas, here's a lot of Latino areas, here's Native Alaskans, a lot of Native American reservations and so on across the country. So it's just to say that many, many people still think of climate change as a distant problem. So just to conclude, again, this is just touching the surface. About half of Americans are starting to connect the dots between climate change and extreme weather. And it's really important that we help people understand that climate change is right here, it's right now. But many still think of climate change impacts as distant in time and space. And then to really boil it down to its most essential key concepts, that scientists agree it's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope, as in we have the solutions we need to solve this. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you for ending on such a positive note that there's hope.
So we've just heard from Senator Whitehouse on several critical legislative and policy initiatives. Turning to the business sector, we're so fortunate tonight to have Maura McKnight, Executive Director of the Business Council on Climate Change, with us. Maura, would you tell us about some of the innovative responses arising from collaborations you are seeing in the business sector?
Yes, absolutely. And let me just share my screen here and get it into presenting mode. Everyone can see that? All right. So thank you so much. Really an honor to be here and in such great company. Really, I was personally really inspired to hear Senator Whitehouse's comments. We at the Business Council on Climate Change are also tracking, obviously, this reconciliation process and are so thrilled to hopefully see the carbon pricing element come to fruition. Fingers crossed, everything goes through this fall. It's really important that that legislation gets passed. So my goal today is to give you an overview of some of the action going on in the corporate sector around climate. Since it's a short presentation, I'm going to be going lightning quick through some pretty dense topics. I just want to apologize in advance to some of you if some of these are fresh concepts. Consider this a taster. You know, you might hear terms and hear of organizations for the first time, and hopefully I can provide some threads that you can follow through on your own if you're interested in. So let me start with a quick introduction of our organization. I won't spend a ton of time here, but I want you to know who we are before I dive into kind of the broader overview of the corporate sector. So we're based in San Francisco, and we're dedicated to incubating, scaling, and sharing world-leading solutions to address climate change. We were founded in 2007, actually when Gavin Newsom was mayor of the city of San Francisco, and the city helped launch our organization as a cross-sector partnership. We're now a standalone nonprofit and a small but mighty team of 3 people, so a very small team, and we work with our members to affect change. These are our members. We currently have 26 member organizations, most of them from the corporate sector, brands, some of whom you recognize, obviously. And these members represent over 200 billion in annual revenue, and these companies employ over 700,000 people in total. So in terms of how we work, we're a very membership-driven organization, very agile. We help facilitate adaptable working groups with our members. They help lead them with our support. And really, we're focused on 3 key strategies. We want to help our members learn rapidly together. So we bring sustainability leaders together so they can learn from their peers rapidly. This space is changing very quickly. They need to do it with peers. We help them find opportunities to solve problems together in addressing climate change within their organizations and beyond their borders. And then we find opportunities for these companies and organizations to act collaboratively together to address climate change. So that's in a snapshot. That's a snapshot of who we are and what we do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is the slide that shows, the general climate crisis, everything that Tony was covering as well. The big message is we are not on track for this 1.5 degree world, and we are way behind. So running out of time here. So this shows by 2030, the gap between where we would need to be to meet the 1.5 goal and, the current commitments are only bringing us so far. So there's a big gap to address. I'm just getting my bar out of the way here. So let's dive into kind of what businesses are doing around action on the climate crisis. So climate action has become urgent. These are my 3 main kind of messages for you today. Climate action has become urgent for the corporate sector, and I will talk a little bit about what that looks like. A lot of the activities that are happening right now are voluntary in the corporate space to reduce their emissions and offset or remove emissions. That is changing, but we'll talk about that. And then collaboration is starting to drive more innovation and scale in this space. So what is driving this corporate climate action? I like to call it mainly, you can think of the trifecta now. It's kind of a perfect storm, in my mind, a good one, putting pressure on companies, right? So the perfect trifecta of investor pressure, pressure from their customers, and pressure from their employees. They kind of can't escape anymore, right? So from all sides, they are wanting to see the same thing and answer the same question. All those 3, influencers are trying to say, what are you doing on climate? What's your plan? What's your impact? What's your plan? And you can see on the right-hand side there in terms of customers, over half of consumers surveyed in this report said that in the future, they won't do business with any company that doesn't take a stand on climate, right? So there is a growing trend here. There's also a big need for speed in the corporate sector. There are many companies that haven't started to do their carbon accounting or make commitments, and they're starting now and they are trying to play catch up, and there's a lot to do very quickly. There's also corporate peer pressure. A lot of CEOs are starting to take a leadership role here and bring their peers along. And the final one that's becoming hot and heavy right now is emerging policies. So that move from voluntary action to mandated action, it's happening right now. So those are the pressures on corporations in terms of driving the action. What does current action look like for corporations? In a nutshell, these are the 3 things for right now that companies are looking at, right? First of all, reporting and disclosing their emissions. Again, this is mostly voluntary right now. So how do they measure their impact, their carbon emissions? Are they reporting them, and how are they doing that? Putting together plans for reducing their emissions. They're setting targets, again, mostly voluntary right now. And then annually, how are they meeting those targets in the short term and then long term? And then how might they deal with residual emissions, or how are they already dealing with their residual emissions, those ones that they can't reduce? This is where it gets a little bit wonky. In terms of measuring and reporting, There is a nonprofit called CDP that helps a lot of companies and also municipal entities, cities and states report their environmental impacts, especially carbon emissions. So some people are reporting through CDP, but not all. And you may have heard these terms: scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, scope 3 emissions. You should look that up if that's not familiar to you. It's a very important part of this dynamic here. For the most part right now, scope 1 is your direct emissions from your, the facilities and vehicles, et cetera, that you operate and own. The scope 2 is comes from your indirect operations emissions. Like that would be things like all the energy you buy globally. And then scope 3 is everything else. And it's mostly things that are indirect outside of your immediate control, like your entire supply chain and what the emissions of all of your suppliers are, right? That is the hardest to measure, hardest to account for, hardest to affect change in that world. This is like my little, someone else shared this recently too. Most people are reporting scope 1 and 2. That's the tip of the iceberg. Scope 3 is below the water. So this is something very important to realize, that companies are just now learning how to account for and report on their scopes 1 and 2. It's the scope 3 that's really the elephant in the room. Just a heads up on that. I think for some companies, their entire emissions footprint, scope 3 might be 70 to 90% of their entire footprint. So that's how important it is. The policy landscape is changing right now. So if you haven't heard about the proposed SEC rule, that's something to look up, really exciting. It would require publicly traded companies to disclose their emissions annually through their financial reporting process. It's still a proposed rule. They just announced it recently. Also in California, there's some legislation moving through the California legislature. It actually passed the Senate in California, and it's going to be moving into the Assembly this summer, called SB 260. It would require public and private companies to disclose emissions if they do business in California. So it's the first state to kind of come up with legislation around this disclosure. And the SEC rule and the California SB 260 rule are similar and different, but both are trying to get at the same thing, right? Mandated disclosure of emissions. So this stuff is moving right now. If these don't move forward, this world is coming no matter what. And then also, investors, these are a couple of, TCFD is a framework that investors put together in 2017, and it was used as a basis for the SEC rule. There's also a huge alliance of investors that launched last year during COP, GFEM's Alliance for Net Zero, that hold 130 trillion in assets, right? So investors and regulators are going to be really interested in disclosures going forward. Oop, wrong way. So what does it mean for a company to set a target, right? Setting big targets if you're a big corporation. I started this role as the director at VC3 4 years ago. And on the left-hand side, that's what it looked like in the corporate world. People were setting emissions reductions targets. They were setting carbon neutral targets. Very few of them were setting net zero targets, but it was all over the map and it was a mess. That world is starting to consolidate right now. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the direction I think most people think it's all heading is for large corporations to be setting net zero targets that are science-based. Those terms have meaning. This science-based term, if you haven't heard it, there's an organization, a nonprofit called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It is a partnership between a number of other nonprofits like WWF, WRI, the UN, CDP, but it's an independent party that verifies targets, right? And so if you were going to set a science-based emissions reduction target, you would have to apply to them, give them your baseline and give them your target, and they would have to approve it, right? And so that is becoming it's kind of the gold standard now, right? So now the gold standard for corporate goals is a science-based target. And they recently, last year, the Science-Based Target Initiative also announced a net zero science-based target. So that's kind of the direction the big companies, if they're not there already, that is where they are headed very quickly. I'll just give you an example. This is one of our member companies. You can find this online. This is Salesforce. This is their public climate action plan. It shows you how some of these larger companies are starting to put together kind of like an overall climate action plan, how they are addressing it both internally and beyond their company borders, right? So it's kind of action on all fronts. So a company like Salesforce has been public about the fact that they're going to be putting dollars and staffing behind climate advocacy. So they're trying to influence climate policy on one side. They're doing their own emissions reduction work. They're dealing with residual emissions through carbon removal. They're investing in nature-based solutions like the Trillion Trees Initiative. They're doing a ton around renewable energy. It goes on and on and on, right? And they're trying to influence their sector and their partners. So that's an example of what corporate climate action looks like from one company's perspective. And another example of collaborative action, which just came out last week, if people did not see the news, really exciting announcement from a number of companies. So this is a collaborative announcement that also sends really strong demand signals to the emerging carbon removals market. Some of you may know carbon removals is obviously a contentious space, but the ICC report says that we're not going to get to our goals without it. So the big focus is on removing carbon from your own value chain, but there's always going to be residual emissions, and the removals space is one that needs a lot of investment to reach our goals. So there was recently a $1 billion announcement, the Frontier Fund, led by basically Google, Facebook, Stripe, Shopify, McKinsey. So this type of thing we're probably going to start seeing more of. It's very exciting. It will help shape the emerging carbon removals market. At BC3, we are also trying to support our members because not all of our 26 members, right, are going to be able to make $1 billion announcements, right? And what about the rest of the corporate space, and how can we drive demand and action? The carbon removals market is a nascent space, for the most part, still unregulated. Companies are nervous about moving into it without a strong strategy. So we're trying to support kind of the second wave of corporate movers in terms of getting familiar with this space, understanding it, and maybe looking at collective purchasing options together with their peers. So we're trying to help them. We have a quick start guide for anyone that can use on our website to start to understand the corporate landscape for removals investments. And in general, where we focus our work with our members is helping them collaborate for scale. So we have active working groups for our climate leadership, sustainability folks to meet and troubleshoot together around their climate goals. We have an effort underway around supply chain sustainability to help them do that as well and aggregate, educate their suppliers and share resources to help their suppliers move the needle. And we also have this carbon removals working group, and we focus on policy both at the local level in San Francisco as well as state and federal level in terms of sharing activities that companies can get involved in. And then I'll just share as I'm wrapping up, one example of collective impact in the past. We had 5 different member companies come together to purchase renewable energy together in aggregate, and they kind of built a blueprint for aggregate virtual renewable energy purchases. So this was a couple of years ago, and it also just showed how these companies could help. There were 1 or 2 leaders in the group that really helped the entire group come along the way. They all shared a single contract. Lawyers were on the phone together. I mean, this is pretty unusual in the corporate space, right? Like, we're all going to share the same contract. We're going to have our lawyers on the phone together, editing the contract, et cetera. So it was a really great milestone. So this is the type of work that we try and do with our members. And we hope to do more of this type of thing going forward, again, in the removal space and other places where we can kind of share the load and increase impact together. So I think in wrapping up, I know I covered a lot of ground, but I think the thing I want to say to you all is that climate action has become urgent for the corporate sector. And there is a move underway. This voluntary action is likely to become mandatory very soon, and in months, probably not years. And that this space is changing very rapidly. And I think that companies have an important leadership role to play because they can often move much more quickly than government. And right now that's an advantage in some spaces. So I'm hoping to kind of bring companies together going forward around a lot of the topics we discussed today. And we have a website up here if you guys want. Also, there's the link to the removals resources if people are curious too, but I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A. And yeah, thank you all. Have a good night.
Maura, that's so exciting. It's amazing how much is really being done. I think that so few of us really understand what's happening in a lot of these corporate boardrooms. But what does this really mean for us as individuals? And I'd like to turn the program over to David Pogue to talk to us about a practical guide for living with climate change and also helping to mitigate against it. Thank you, David, for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now, and I trust you can all see this. So I'm the author of this massive 620-page. Oh.
David, I think we're just seeing a white screen.
Uh-oh. Okay. How about now? See anything?
No.
All right. Let me cancel that and try again. Share screen. Let's try this. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm the author of this massive book called How to Prepare for Climate Change. And the concept stemmed from John Holdren's comments. He was Obama's chief science advisor. And he said, we basically have three choices when it comes to climate change. There's mitigation, which is trying to stop climate change, adaptation, which means coping with what we've got, and suffering. The question is what the mix is going to be. So that's interesting. So really two ways we can respond. One is mitigation, and you hear a lot about that. Fly less, eat less red meat, take public transportation. I think every American's probably heard some of that. And there are so many books on mitigation. I mean, on and on and on, how to reduce your climate footprint. Very important. We all need to do it. But what about the second part of his formula? What about adaptation? As far as I know, there's only one book on that topic. And, you know, corporations and governments adapt. You know, they build seawalls, they develop seeds that can withstand drought, that kind of thing. But, you know, the individual is not going to build a seawall this weekend. So this book is intended to talk about how you can prepare to make yourself more resilient, to protect your family, your house, and yourself in the new realm. I'd like to say on behalf of all of us speakers that I think we can do better in reaching people with better terminology. It makes me crazy when people try to speak to lay people in Celsius. Americans don't use Celsius, we use Fahrenheit. So the IPCC says, yeah, we need to watch out for the 1.5 degrees. No, it's basically 3 degrees, which sounds much more dramatic and scary. I also don't like the greenhouse effect. Most people have never been in a greenhouse, don't understand that it's 20 degrees warmer in there than it is outside. I say if you want to reach people, you call it the dog in the car effect. That people get. It's the same exact effect, right? Sunlight comes in, heats up the upholstery, infrared energy gets trapped inside by the windows. We're the dog. And also, I don't like the term global warming. Does this look like global warming to you? This was Texas last year, a freak devastating snowstorm, cold snap. You know, they don't have winter coats in Texas. They don't have salt trucks or snow plows. It had never happened. So global warming, yeah. I mean, what's happening in the climate crisis is freak heat waves and freak cold snaps. It's freak flooding and freak water shortages. It's droughts and intense rains. And then it's all these secondary, tertiary effects that, you know, you hear sometimes, but not everybody understands how that's related to warming. And even these really strange things, Tornado Alley is shifting to the east, beaches are getting smaller, chocolate's getting more expensive, more kidney stones, smaller goats, lower PSAT scores. That's how you get people's attention, lower PSAT scores. And so I really think there are better terms than global warming. Otherwise, you're going to sound like that, you know, that dumb congressman who walked in with a snowball and said, "Does this look like warming to you?" So, you know, I've heard climate chaos, climate breakdown. I like global weirding. I think that'll get people's attention. So the Yale folks were very crusty and restrictive about my time here. They wanted me to keep it under 4 hours. So I'm just going to dive into a couple of topics in the book. The book covers every conceivable aspect of personal adaptation: where to live, how to build your house, what to grow, where to invest, how to insure, how to protect your children, and then individual chapters on all the different disasters. But the most popular one, it turns out to be where to live. Not everybody has the freedom or the money to move arbitrarily, but 40 million Americans do move every year for change of jobs, change of relationship, entering or exiting the military or college or whatever. And you might now be considering this as a factor in deciding where you want to live. So basically, there's nowhere you can go to in this country to escape the effects of the changing climate. But in short, you want to be west to avoid the sea level rise and the hurricanes. You want to be north to avoid the heat waves. You want to be east far enough to avoid the droughts and the wildfires. So where that leaves you, I was going to say, I feel like the droughts are underplayed in the media. It's not as dramatic as wildfire footage or hurricane footage. Like, what are you going to put on the evening news? A brown field? It's just not very telegenic. So, but it's a serious problem. I mean, the reservoirs are drying up, the aquifers are drying up. So the answer to all of this, the sweet spot, is the Great Lakes region. It's above the 42nd parallel. I mean, these great old Rust Belt cities, they're cheap cost of living, great quality of life, very nice people, and they're ready for the immigration. I mean, they don't have wildfires or floods or sea level rise or drought. They don't have any of that. They don't even have many of the ticks and mosquitoes. And yeah, you're like, well, but Madison's cold. Used to be cold in the winter. It's gone up, the lows of the winter have gone up 5 degrees since the 80s, and they're expected to go up another 11 degrees by 2050. So those winters are not going to be as warm as you think. 1/3 of all residential real estate in Vancouver is now owned by Chinese investors. So the Chinese are very canny about where people are going to be moving as the planet heats up. They're going to be moving north. And the book outlines 15 great cities, and it's not just about climate havenness. It's about whether you'd want to live there, whether they have good culture, and how's the hospitals. Hospitals is something you're going to need to think about in the climate crisis era. Madison, Wisconsin kept coming up as a #1 best town. They have 5 lakes, incredibly active, nice population, and they have these zoning rules. Like, you can't build anything taller than the state capitol building, shown here, so it can never become a concrete jungle. Burlington, Vermont feels like a seaside town because they're on Lake Champlain, this 500-mile lake, but they don't have hurricanes and they don't have sea level rise. They have the lowest crime rate in the country, highly educated populace, and really good ice cream and maple syrup. Buffalo, another one right near the Great Lakes, great medical facilities, dirt cheap costs of living. And the other thing, because we've touched on this a little bit tonight, that the other one that gets a rise to a lot of people is the last chapter in the book, which is Where to Find Hope. I wrote this book during the Trump administration when we pulled out of the Paris Agreement and the words climate change had been scrubbed from all the federal websites. And I was a little depressed. And it was harder to find hope at that time. But now in the last 2 years, I feel like, I mean, first of all, no matter what your political bent, we did elect a guy who spoke nonstop about the climate crisis, every single talk he gave. These headlines around the outside, those are all things that passed. These are all things that have happened. The one in the box in the lower right, Congress is trying to stall and block him, and so they might not all come to pass. But they are building the charging network. We did rejoin the Paris Accord. The car emission standards have been tightened up. He did install climate scientists all through the administration. And also remember that while we had pulled out of the Paris Agreement, half of the states announced that they were staying in. These states all agreed to remain held to the Paris goals. So it wasn't necessarily a matter of the whole United States thrown in the towel. Our gas emissions have in fact been dropping. It's not necessarily because we're all such good stewards of the earth. A lot of this is just because we switched from coal to natural gas, which is awful, but not nearly as awful as coal. So, but the emissions are in fact going down, and that's what matters. There are these more already referred to some of these trillion trees carbon removal systems. These are nature's carbon removal systems, and there are many, many efforts to reforest the earth. As fast as Brazil can burn them down, we're building them right back. And coal, there are no new coal plants plan for the United States. Zero. Coal is dead in the country. I feel sorry for you coal miners, but honestly, there are already twice as many jobs in solar as there are in coal in the whole country. Coal is basically dead, and it's not just in this country, it's dropping everywhere, which is fantastic. Not in China, but almost everywhere else. And even in China, they already are the world's leader in solar power. The satellite photos show more green in China and India. China's agreed to stop building coal plants for other countries. It used to be a big export of that technology. And you know what? China was in the Paris Agreement before we were. They've been in it from the beginning, and they re-upped last year. The president says they are going for carbon neutrality by 2060. That's something that we haven't even said. So China is a mixed bag, but there are a lot of good indicators. Look, their rising middle class doesn't want to grow up in a polluted, carcinogenic atmosphere either. So they want clean air and water as well. We've seen some incredible shifts in where we get our power. Last year, this is amazing, 77% of all new electrical capacity in the United States came from solar and wind. 77%. And guess how much of it was coming from coal? Nothing. No new coal. And in the nuclear realm, I know everyone's afraid of nuclear, but there's some cool technologies that I wrote about and researched in the book. For example, there's this thing called traveling wave nuclear. You got to remember that we developed nuclear power plants at the same time we developed nuclear bombs, and that was on purpose. They used this uranium isotope called U-235 because it could be weaponized. The government did. Now we don't have that restriction. And it turns out that 99% of all uranium is a different isotope called U-238 that now we just throw away. The miners just throw it away. If we could make that power nuclear, it can't melt down, it can't be weaponized. Bill Gates' Department of Energy and Los Alamos are all really into this. And then there's another element called thorium that's 500 times as abundant in the Earth's crust as uranium, can't be melted down, can't melt down, can't be weaponized. There's very little nuclear waste from it. You don't need the cooling ponds, so you can build these things anywhere. 6 countries are working on this technology. Just remember that wherever we are in the technological landscape, it's a temporary fix. It just, we don't have horse and buggies anymore. We don't have hand set type for newspapers. Technology does march on. Maura already referred to the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP.net, but 10,000 companies are listed by that website reporting what they're doing about the climate crisis. 250 of them have committed to 100% renewable. And the tech companies especially, I mean, Microsoft, they've been carbon neutral since 2012. By 2050, they say they're going to have removed all the carbon they've ever put into the air since they were founded in 1979. I mean, that's going to rely on them developing these carbon removal plants that Maura talked about, but they've made the promise. We'll see if they can fulfill it. I'm doing a story right now on these carbon removal plants, and so watch CBS Sunday Morning in the next month. It's a really cool technology. So in short, there are really 2 reasons that you should think about preparing. One is you'll be ready when disaster does come. They're saying that 25% of Americans a year get hit by one weather disaster or another, and the resilient among you will ride it out better. And the other reason is kind of a stealth reason. Depression is defined not as, oh, my situation is terrible, but my situation is terrible and I'm helpless to change it. And it turns out that every psychiatrist or psychologist will tell you that the way to overcome depression is finding ways to take control where you feel you don't have any. So taking action is how you overcome depression, and taking action against this climate crisis that's getting you down is what adaptation is all about. It's what this whole book is about. So you will sleep better at night if you make a go bag, research your insurance, which is probably old and out of date, download an app that gives you early warning when a disaster is coming, and so on. So in the meantime, I think decarbonization will come. Everybody keeps asking me, are we going to make it? It's not, are we going to make it? Because it's a sliding scale. Are we going to get back to the weather of the 1980s? No, we're not. That's not in our lifetime, not in your children's lifetime. But maybe in 60 or 70 years, we will complete decarbonization. And it's these pictures of young people that makes me believe that. We, the old guard, we have entrenched interests, okay? We're beholden to the coal industry, the gas industry, okay? But the young people who are going to take our places do not. They're going to decarbonize. Until then, I advise you to prepare. Thank you so much. Happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you. That was fantastic. We are going to move to questions and answers now. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. In addition to that, I'm going to use this opportunity to introduce Chip Spear, who's the co-chair of Yale Blue Green, who's going to kick us off with the first question.
Well, thank you very, very much, Uslin. I appreciate it. So I think the real first question I have is pretty pragmatic. You know, that you read so much today in newspapers and online, and we see so much in the news about climate change, but sometimes we're all overwhelmed by, you know, what are the options? What can I do to be most effective? So I'd like to ask the panel, if I was going to do one or maybe two things, what should be the most, or what could be the most impactful as an individual?
I'll take that. Michael Mann has a great new book on climate change, in which he asserts that the whole thing about making individuals think they're responsible is a big fake out by industry. In other words, the average corporation pollutes 1,000 times more than you ever will. So if you think you're going to replace your light bulbs with LEDs and make a dent, you're mistaken. So he and I would both advise you to put most of your effort into amplifying the change. And that's through voting, that's through organized actions, that's through political movements. And I don't mean electing presidents, I mean your school, your church, the local community, the companies you invest in. You can go to their board meetings, shareholder meetings, and say, what are you guys doing about your emissions? So the more you can affect masses of people beyond yourself, the more powerful you are and the quicker the changes you make.
I have come to a similar conclusion that political action, you know, we got Citizens United because of politics, and look at the impact that that's made. So, yeah. Thank you.
I have one other question, which is, as a lay person, you hear so much about so many different things. And tonight I heard some very hopeful things about initiatives taking place by scientists who are solving the problem, about corporations working hard together to solve problems, about the new generation and what they're going to bring. But on a really practical level, what should I be focused on aside from political action?
Well, you guys have probably all heard the beef argument, but cows are the worst. 10% of all climate emissions come from these monstrous animals that belch out 10 gallons of methane per hour per cow. 1/3 of the Earth's entire non-frozen land surface. This is a statistic that will freak you out. 1/3 of the planet we've dedicated to cattle grazing. So they're a disaster with resources, with water, with grain, with food. If you can cut down to once a week or none a week, that is probably the biggest single action an individual or a family can take.
So I'll add to that. So first of all, I agree. The first and most important thing we can all do is try to change the political system. So that is really the critical thing. That said, there's also the economic system. And so we're all in, I mean, I'm assuming most of the people on here have pension plans or mutual funds or investors. So I'll just use an example of a great group in the UK called Make My Money Matter. They've done the analysis and found that you could cut out all your flights, you could go vegan, you can buy all electric, you can drive an electric car and all that stuff. And your investments are still going to produce 27 times the carbon emissions as all of your individual behaviors combined. Okay, and that is another of your superpowers, is that you are an investor. You can raise your voice and say, I don't want my money to go in support of further fossil fuels at the exact moment. Well, you know the old saying, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Okay, so if nothing else, let's stop building more fossil fuels and instead take that money and invest in the clean, sustainable, stable future that we actually want to live in. So I would just say your investments and your voice as an investor is at least as powerful as your voice as a voter.
Oh, and I'd love to just add to that. Check this out. It is also a good way to make money, because this, you can see this compares if you'd invested in petroleum stocks 10 years ago, the bottom line, whereas the regular stock market is at the top. And if you'd invested 5 years ago $1,000 worth into clean energy stocks, you'd be up 60%. If you'd invested in fossil fuel stocks, you'd have lost 12%. So green stocks also turn out to be a terrific investment.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that in terms of, depending on where people work, another action in terms of if you're not independently investing, we all have our 401ks, et cetera. You can also talk to your employer, right? And you could be an advocate internally at no matter what company or organization you're in. Go talk to the HR team and put a team of employees together to have a conversation about where they're investing their 401k dollars, because those are your dollars, right? So that's another, if you're not an investor, you actually are if you have a 401k, right? And so a lot of that sometimes starts with individual action. You might not know how to approach the conversation, but go start asking questions of your company and your employer, right? That's another great action you can take, even if you're not a formal investor.
Great, that's fantastic. I know that all of your time is limited, and I want to be really respectful of people's times. We did talk about John Smith. I see you have your hand raised and you're muted. Could you unmute?
Yeah, it's a quick question. This was built on being on regional differences, and it's wound up being much more general than that. So I'm wondering if someone could propose where one could go for specific information. I live on Vancouver Island. I work on, sorry about the dog, work on the American South as my research area. And I'd like to be able to quote estimates of specific, I don't mind that it's in Celsius, degree changes for those regions. So I'm wondering where I can get that information. Thanks.
Tony, do you have access to that information?
I'm sorry, the question is, where can you find better climate information about where you live?
About specific regions of the US and North America.
Yeah, no better place to start than the National Climate Assessment. And this is produced by NOAA and NASA and the US government. They built a really nice interactive website, and you can zoom right in on your location and learn about the major hazards and vulnerabilities where you are.
Tony, can you put the link for that into the chat as well? We are building a set of resources that will be included with the transcript of this event. So you all have access to that.